started working on pieces which turned out in the end to be Dark Side of the Moon.
You know the prism. You know the heartbeat. You've probably heard Money 1,000 times on classic rock radio. Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon is one of the most successful albums in history, spending over 900 weeks on the Billboard charts and selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. But behind that iconic cover and those legendary tracks were studio musicians, vocalists, and engineers whose contributions were essential to making the album what it became, and most of them never saw a penny in royalties or got the recognition they deserved. This is the story of how one album made Pink Floyd icons while leaving the people who helped create it largely forgotten. In 1972, Pink Floyd was already an established progressive rock band, but they weren't the cultural phenomenon they'd become. They'd had some success with albums like Metal and Atom Heart Mother, and they were known for their elaborate live shows and experimental approach to music. But they hadn't yet created the album that would define not just their career, but an entire era of rock music. Roger Waters, the band's bassist and primary lyricist, had been working on a concept for an album about the pressures and anxieties of modern life. The idea was to explore themes that everyone dealt with: stress, time, mortality, mental health, conflict, greed. These weren't the fantastical or abstract themes that progressive rock often dealt with. These were real, human concerns that audiences could connect with on a personal level. The band began working on the material in early 1972, performing early versions of the songs during their tours before ever entering a recording studio. They'd play what they called Eclipse, a piece for assorted lunatics at concerts, testing material in front of live audiences, refining the arrangements based on what worked and what didn't. This process gave them a head start when they finally began recording in earnest at Abbey Road Studios in London. Abbey Road was already legendary by 1972, having hosted the Beatles' most famous recordings just a few years earlier. Pink Floyd had worked there before and had a good relationship with the engineering staff. They were assigned to work with engineer Alan Parsons, who'd worked on the Beatles' Abbey Road album, and was developing a reputation as one of the best in the business at capturing complex soundscapes. The recording sessions for Dark Side of the Moon lasted from June 1972 to January 1973, an unusually long time by the standards of the early 1970s. Most rock albums were recorded in a matter of weeks. Pink Floyd spent 7 months in the studio experimenting, layering, perfecting every detail of the sound they wanted to achieve. This meticulous approach would become one of the album's defining characteristics. From the beginning, the band knew they wanted more than just the four of them playing instruments and singing. They wanted to create something sonically rich and textured, something that would reward repeated listening with new details and layers. That meant bringing in additional musicians, vocalists, and contributors to help realize their vision. But here's where the story gets complicated. The first major outside contribution came from saxophonist Dick Perry. Perry was an old friend of David Gilmour's from Cambridge, and Gilmour suggested bringing him in to play on Us and Them and Money. Perry's saxophone work on these tracks is iconic. The mournful, jazzy solos on Us and Them and the bluesy riffs on Money are as recognizable as any guitar solo on the album. Perry's playing on Us and Them is particularly noteworthy. The song deals with conflict and war, with the futility of fighting, and Perry's saxophone adds a layer of melancholy beauty that elevates the entire track. His solos aren't aggressive or showy. They're contemplative, sad, perfectly matching the song's themes. The tone he achieved, the phrasing he chose, the emotion he conveyed, all of it was exactly what the song needed. On Money, Perry's approach was different. The song is satirical, darker, with its unusual 7/4-time signature and cynical lyrics about greed. Perry's saxophone work here is bluesier, more commercial sounding in a way that matches the song's critique of capitalism and commercialism. He wasn't just adding instrumental color, he was enhancing the thematic content of the songs through his playing. Perry came into the studio, recorded his parts over a few sessions, and was paid a session fee. a flat rate for his work that was standard practice at the time. He signed paperwork that gave Pink Floyd ownership of the recordings and any future royalties. This was normal for session musicians. You came in, did your job, got paid, and moved on. The idea that the album would still be selling millions of copies 50 years later probably didn't occur to anyone involved. The session fee Perry received was decent for the time, probably a few £100 for a few days' work. But over the decades since, Dark Side of the Moon has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Perry received none of that. His iconic saxophone work, which is as much a part of the album's identity as anything the band members played, earned him only that initial session payment. Perry has spoken about this in interviews over the years, and while he's not bitter, there's clearly some frustration. He's proud of his contribution to the album and grateful for the opportunities it opened up. He played with Pink Floyd on several tours after the album's release and appeared on some of their later albums, including Wish You Were Here. But the economic reality is stark. His work helped create something worth hundreds of millions, and he was compensated as if he'd just played on any random album that sold a few thousand copies. The recognition Perry did receive came primarily from other musicians and serious Pink Floyd fans who knew the album's credits and history. For casual listeners, the saxophone on Money and Us and Them was just part of Pink Floyd's sound, not a specific individual's contribution. Perry didn't become a household name the way session musicians on some other landmark albums did. He remained a sideman, someone appreciated by insiders but largely unknown to the general public. In later years, as the album's legacy grew and became the subject of documentary films and detailed histories, Perry's name came up more often. He'd give occasional interviews about his experience recording the album, describing the studio atmosphere, the creative process, what it was like to work with the band. These interviews gave him some belated recognition, but they couldn't change the fundamental economic reality that he'd signed away any ongoing financial stake in the album's success. But Perry's situation at least included some ongoing recognition and opportunities. Other contributors to Dark Side of the Moon fared worse, their names and contributions fading into obscurity despite being audible on one of the most played albums in history. The most striking example involves the voices scattered throughout the album. Dark Side of the Moon is famous for the spoken word snippets that appear between and during songs, people discussing money, death, violence, mental health, and other themes. These weren't actors reading scripts. They were real people, studio staff, roadies, Abbey Road employees, who were recorded answering questions that Roger Waters had prepared on cards. The questions were simple but profound. What's the dark side of the moon? What does money mean to you? When was the last time you were violent? Have you ever been mad? The answers were recorded on tape, and Pink Floyd went through hours of recordings to select the snippets that made it onto the album. Some responses were philosophical, some were funny, some were disturbing. Together, they created a tapestry of human experience that grounded the album's abstract musical explorations in real voices and real perspectives. One of the most memorable voices on the album belongs to Roger the Hat Manifold, a roadie for Pink Floyd who was hanging around Abbey Road during the recording sessions. Manifold was the one who delivered the line about being mad, describing an experience where he'd reacted to a situation in a way he later regretted. His working-class Irish accent and candid delivery made the moment memorable, and it became one of the album's most recognizable spoken word segments. Manifold was paid nothing for his contribution. He was a roadie who happened to be in the studio when they were recording these interviews, and he answered some questions. Nobody thought to pay him or to give him credit on the album. For decades, most listeners didn't even know who that voice belonged to. Manifold himself didn't make a big deal of it. He was just part of the crew, doing what he was asked to do. Years later, when Dark Side of the Moon had become one of the best-selling albums of all time, Manifold's contribution was still uncompensated. He worked for Pink Floyd for years after the album's release, continuing as a roadie, setting up equipment, helping with tours. He never received royalties for the album he helped make iconic with his voice. When he passed away in 2018, obituaries mentioned his connection to the album, but by then it was too late for any recognition to matter. Other voices on the album belong to people whose identities remained unknown for decades. Abbey Road doorman Jerry O'Driscoll provided one of the album's most quoted lines about the dark side of the moon not actually existing and everything being in sync. His philosophical musings, delivered in his Liverpool accent, became part of the album's mystique, but O'Driscoll received no payment beyond his doorman's wages and no credit on the album packaging. The wife of Abbey Road's engineer, who was visiting the studio during recording, answered questions about dying and about looking forward to things. Her voice appears on The Great Gig in the Sky, adding haunting spoken word elements between the legendary vocal performance. She wasn't paid, wasn't credited, and most people have no idea who she was or is. This brings us to the most controversial credit situation on the entire album: Claire Torrey and her performance on The Great Gig in the Sky. Torrey was a session singer who'd worked at Abbey Road before, providing backing vocals on various projects. Alan Parsons suggested bringing her in to add vocals to an instrumental track that the band felt needed something extra. Torrey came to the studio one Sunday evening in January 1973. The band played her the instrumental track and told her to improvise something emotional over it, to sing about death without using words, just using her voice as an instrument. Torrey was initially hesitant, unsure of what they wanted, but she gave it a try. She delivered 3 takes of improvised vocal performance, each one different, each one exploring different emotional territory. The performance Torrey created in that session is one of the most iconic vocal performances in rock history. Her wordless wails, moans, and cries perfectly captured the fear, anger, acceptance, and transcendence that the song was trying to express. It's harrowing and beautiful and impossible to imagine the album without it. Many people consider The Great Gig in the Sky to be the emotional peak of the entire album, and that's almost entirely due to Torrey's contribution. Torrey was paid £30 for the session, roughly the equivalent of a few $100s today. She signed a standard session musician contract that gave Pink Floyd ownership of the recording and all future rights. She left thinking she'd done a decent job on what seemed like an interesting but not particularly special project. She had no idea that her improvised vocal performance would become legendary. When Dark Side of the Moon was released in March 1973, Torrey wasn't credited on the album. Her name appeared nowhere on the packaging, despite the fact that The Great Gig in the Sky was almost entirely her performance over the band's instrumental track. This wasn't unusual for session musicians at the time. Backing vocalists and session players often weren't credited, especially if they were just hired for a quick session and paid a flat fee. The album became a massive hit immediately. It reached #1 in the US, eventually going platinum multiple times over, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. The Great Gig in the Sky was one of the standout tracks, frequently cited as a fan favorite and a highlight of the album's exploration of mortality and transcendence. And Claire Torrey watched all of this happen, while receiving nothing beyond her original £30 session fee. For years, Torrey's contribution went largely unrecognized. When people praised The Great Gig in the Sky, they often didn't know there was a specific singer performing those vocals. Some assumed it was just a member of Pink Floyd or someone in their immediate circle. Torrey continued working as a session musician, but the lack of credit on such a massively successful album meant she couldn't even use it properly to advance her career. The situation became more frustrating as the decades passed and Dark Side of the Moon continued to sell and sell. By the 1980s and 1990s, the album had become a cultural touchstone, played at planetariums, dissected in music classes, cited as one of the greatest albums ever made. Torrey's performance was integral to that success, but she'd been compensated as if she'd just sung on any random track that would be forgotten in a few years. In 2004, more than 30 years after the recording session, Torrey decided to take legal action. She sued Pink Floyd and EMI, arguing that her vocal performance was substantial enough to be considered a co-authorship of The Great Gig in the Sky, and that she deserved songwriting credit and retroactive royalties. The case was complicated because it involved questions about the nature of improvisation, about what constitutes composition versus performance, about contracts signed decades earlier under very different circumstances. Tori's legal argument centered on the idea that her improvisational vocal performance wasn't just performing someone else's composition, it was creating the composition itself. The instrumental track that Pink Floyd had recorded was essentially a backing track without a defined melody or structure for the vocal part. When Tori came in and improvised those vocals, she was composing the vocal melody and structure in real time, not executing someone else's predetermined vision. This distinction between performance and composition is crucial in music copyright law. Performers don't typically have ownership claims on the songs they perform, even if their performances are definitive versions. But composers, the people who create the melodic and harmonic structures of songs, do have ownership rights. Tori was arguing that she wasn't just a performer on The Great Gig in the Sky, she was a composer, creating the vocal composition through improvisation. Pink Floyd's defense argued that Tori was doing what she was hired to do as a session vocalist, adding vocal elements to an existing composition. The instrumental track was already complete, the structure was defined, and Tori was filling in one element of an already existing piece. According to this view, her improvisation was skilled performance, but it didn't rise to the level of composition or co-authorship. The case raised interesting questions about improvisation in music. Jazz musicians improvise constantly, creating melodies and variations in real time, but they don't typically claim co-authorship of the songs they're improvising on. The songs belong to their composers, and the improvisations, no matter how brilliant or original, are considered performances. Was Tori's situation different because the vocal part of The Great Gig in the Sky didn't exist before she created it? Or was she just adding improvisational performance to an existing instrumental composition? The case was settled out of court in 2005. The terms of the settlement weren't publicly disclosed, but Tori received an undisclosed sum and was retroactively credited as a co-writer of The Great Gig in the Sky on all subsequent releases of the album. This meant that going forward, she'd receive songwriter royalties whenever the track was played, sold, or licensed. But she still didn't receive retroactive royalties for the 30-plus years between the album's release and the settlement. The settlement represented a significant partial victory for Tori, but it came with important limitations. The songwriting credit meant her name now appeared on one of the most famous tracks in rock history, which gave her recognition she'd lacked for 3 decades. The future royalties meant she'd finally receive ongoing compensation for her contribution. But the settlement couldn't recover the decades of lost royalties, the hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of pounds she should have received if she'd been properly credited from the start. The implications of Tori's case extended beyond her individual situation. It suggested that session musicians who made particularly distinctive and substantial contributions might have legal grounds to challenge the traditional session fee model, at least in extreme cases. It recognized that improvisational creation could constitute composition, not just performance. And it showed that even decades-old contracts might be challengeable if they resulted in grossly unfair outcomes. However, Tori's case also highlighted how difficult and expensive it is to challenge these arrangements. She had to wait 30 years and then engage in lengthy legal proceedings to get recognition and future compensation for work that had been essential to one of the most successful albums in history. Most session musicians don't have the resources, the visibility, or the distinctive individual contributions that would make such legal action viable. The case was settled out of court in 2005. The terms of the settlement weren't publicly disclosed, but Tori received an undisclosed sum and was retroactively credited as a co-writer of The Great Gig in the Sky on all subsequent releases of the album. This meant that going forward, she'd receive songwriter royalties whenever the track was played, sold, or licensed. But she still didn't receive retroactive royalties for the 30-plus years between the album's release and the settlement. The settlement was a partial victory for Tori, but it couldn't change the decades of non-compensation. Even if she received a substantial settlement payment, it was still far less than she would have earned if she'd been properly credited and compensated from the beginning. And the settlement didn't address the broader issue of session musicians being undervalued and exploited by the music industry. Tori's case was unusual in that she had the resources and determination to pursue legal action decades after the fact. Most session musicians don't have that option. They sign contracts, do their work, get paid their session fees, and move on. If the project becomes successful, they're happy for the people they worked with, but don't see any additional benefit themselves. And if they later feel they were inadequately compensated, they usually don't have a legal standing to challenge contracts they signed willingly at the time. The engineering and production work on Dark Side of the Moon presents another dimension to this story. Alan Parsons, as the engineer on the album, played a crucial role in shaping the sound that made it revolutionary. His technical expertise, his understanding of how to capture Pink Floyd's vision, his innovative use of studio technology, all of this was essential to the album's success. Parsons was credited as engineer on the album, which gave him some recognition, and he went on to have a successful career with the Alan Parsons Project. But he also wasn't compensated with royalties from Dark Side of the Moon. Engineers typically received session fees or salaries, not percentages of album sales. So even though Parsons' work was fundamental to making the album sound the way it does, he didn't share in the enormous financial success that followed. The case is somewhat different for Parsons because his credit on such a successful album helped launch his own career and brought him opportunities he might not have had otherwise. But it still illustrates the broader pattern where people who contribute significantly to successful projects often receive only a fraction of the financial rewards, with the bulk going to the credited artists and the record label. The record label, EMI, made enormous profits from Dark Side of the Moon. The album's production costs were relatively low by modern standards, and the returns were astronomical. EMI owned the recordings and controlled distribution, which meant they received the lion's share of the revenue. Pink Floyd, as the credited artists, received royalties based on their contract with EMI, a percentage of sales that amounted to millions of dollars over the years. But the session musicians, the uncredited vocalists, the engineers, the studio staff whose voices appeared on the album, they received only what they'd been paid initially. The economic model of the music industry in the 1970s, and still largely today, funnels most of the profits to labels and credited artists, with everyone else getting flat fees regardless of a project's ultimate success. This wouldn't be such a problem if there were a way to predict which projects would become cultural phenomena and which would fade into obscurity. But in 1972 and 1973, nobody knew that Dark Side of the Moon would still be selling 50 years later. Session musicians like Dick Perry and Claire Torrey made reasonable decisions based on the information they had at the time. They couldn't have predicted that these sessions would result in one of the most successful albums in history. The album's continued commercial success makes these compensation issues even more stark. Dark Side of the Moon has never stopped selling. It's been remastered multiple times, released in new formats from CD to vinyl to digital downloads and streaming. It's been used in movies, television shows, commercials. Every year it generates significant revenue that goes primarily to Pink Floyd and to whoever currently controls the rights. Each remaster and reissue brings new attention and new sales. The 30th anniversary edition in 2003, the 40th anniversary edition in 2011, the 50th anniversary edition in 2023. Each one prompted renewed interest in the album, new purchases from longtime fans and new listeners discovering it for the first time. Music critics wrote retrospective pieces about the album's legacy and influence. Radio stations played special tribute programs. Streaming numbers surged with each anniversary. The album's presence in popular culture has been constant. It's been parodied, homaged, referenced in countless other works. The imagery of the prism has become one of the most recognized symbols in music. Young people who weren't born when the album came out discover it and are blown away by its sophistication and emotional power. Dark Side of the Moon transcended its era and became timeless in a way few albums ever do. But with each new wave of commercial success, with each reissue and anniversary edition, with each licensing deal for films or commercials, the disparity between what Pink Floyd earned and what the contributors received became more glaring. Roger Manifold died having received nothing beyond his roadie wages for his voice that millions heard on the album. Other contributors whose identities remain unknown never got any recognition or compensation at all. Meanwhile, many of the people who contributed to making the album what it is have died without ever receiving proper compensation or recognition. Roger Manifold passed away in 2018. Jerry O'Driscoll died in 2009. Other contributors whose names we still don't know have probably also passed away. Their involvement in one of history's most successful albums known only to themselves and perhaps a few friends and family members. The moral questions raised by this situation are complicated. Pink Floyd didn't set out to exploit anyone. They followed standard industry practices for working with session musicians and studio contributors. They paid what they were supposed to pay according to the contracts and norms of the time. The enormous success of the album was unpredictable, and nobody could have foreseen that it would still be generating revenue 50 years later. The band members themselves were young artists in 1972 and 1973, still figuring out how the music business worked, relying on managers and label executives to handle contractual and financial matters. They were focused on the creative work of making the album as good as it could be, not on predicting what its commercial success might be decades in the future. In many ways, they were as caught up in the machinery of the music industry as the session musicians were. But does following industry standard practices absolve them of responsibility? When an album becomes as successful as Dark Side of the Moon, when it continues to generate millions of dollars in revenue decades after its release, do the artists have an obligation to share more of that success with the people who helped create it? These questions don't have clear answers, and different people have different perspectives on them. Some argue that session musicians know what they're signing up for when they take session work. They're trading potential future earnings for guaranteed immediate payment. They're choosing stability over risk. By that logic, if a project becomes unexpectedly successful, that's just good luck for the credited artists and too bad for the session players. The contracts were fair at the time they were signed, and it's not reasonable to renegotiate them decades later based on outcomes nobody could have predicted. Others argue that there's a moral obligation that goes beyond contractual obligations. When people contribute significantly to something that becomes enormously successful, they deserve to share in that success regardless of what contracts said at the time. The fact that Claire Torrey's vocal performance is essential to The Great Gig in the Sky means she deserves more than a £30 session fee, even if that's what she agreed to at the time. The fact that Dick Perry's saxophone is instantly recognizable to millions of people means his contribution was more valuable than a standard session fee could capture. Pink Floyd themselves have been relatively quiet about these issues over the years. David Gilmour has occasionally mentioned being proud that they gave Dick Perry ongoing opportunities to perform with the band and appear on later albums. Roger Waters has discussed the creative process behind the album and the vision they had for it. But neither has publicly addressed whether they feel the uncredited contributors should have been compensated more generously. The broader music industry has done little to address these systemic issues. Session musicians still typically receive flat fees with no royalty participation. Background vocalists still often go uncredited. Studio engineers and producers have fought for better recognition and compensation with some success, but the basic economic model hasn't changed fundamentally. The advent of streaming has made some of these issues worse. When albums sold as physical products, at least there was substantial revenue being generated. With streaming, per-play royalties are fractions of a cent, and those tiny amounts still go primarily to credited artists and rights holders. Session musicians who weren't credited don't see anything from streaming plays, even when their contributions are essential to the recordings being streamed. Some more recent artists have tried to address these issues by being more generous with credits and royalties. Some have voluntarily given songwriting credits to collaborators who traditionally would have just received session fees. Some have set up profit-sharing arrangements that ensure everyone who contributed significantly to a successful project benefits from that success, but these remain exceptions rather than industry standards. The story of Dark Side of the Moon and its forgotten contributors is not unique. Countless albums, hit songs, and cultural touchstones were created with contributions from people who received minimal compensation and recognition. The music industry's history is full of session musicians, backing vocalists, and studio contributors who helped create iconic recordings and then disappeared from the story. What makes the Dark Side of the Moon case particularly poignant is the scale of the album's success and the fact that some of the contributors are identifiable and have told their stories. We know who Claire Torrey is and what she contributed. We know who Dick Perry is and can hear his saxophone work on two of the album's most famous tracks. We can hear Roger Manifold's voice discussing Madness. These aren't anonymous contributors, they're real people whose work is still being heard by millions of listeners decades later. The album's iconic status also makes the contrast starker. Pink Floyd became rock legends, with their names known to anyone familiar with classic rock. The album's cover art, with its prism and spectrum, is one of the most recognizable images in music. But the people who helped create the sounds on that album, whose voices and instruments are as much a part of its identity as anything Pink Floyd recorded themselves, remain largely unknown to most listeners. For those of us who love Dark Side of the Moon, who've listened to it countless times, who found meaning and comfort in its exploration of human experience, learning about these forgotten contributors adds another layer to the album's story. Every time we hear Dick Perry's saxophone or Claire Torrey's voice or Roger Manifold's words, we're hearing people who created something beautiful and important and received only a fraction of what their work was worth. The album will continue to be celebrated as a masterpiece, as one of the greatest achievements in rock music. Pink Floyd's artistic vision, their willingness to spend months perfecting every detail, their ability to create something that resonated with millions of people, all of that deserves recognition. But that recognition shouldn't come at the expense of forgetting or minimizing the contributions of everyone else who helped make the album what it became. The story of Dark Side of the Moon is ultimately a story about the economics and ethics of creative work. It's about who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, who gets compensated and who gets exploited, who benefits from success and who is left behind. These questions are relevant far beyond the music industry. They apply to any creative field where individual contributors are part of larger collaborative projects. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the album's artistic achievement. Dark Side of the Moon remains a masterpiece of progressive rock, a cultural touchstone, an album that speaks to fundamental human experiences. But understanding who created it, including the people whose names didn't appear on the cover, gives us a fuller and more honest picture of how great art gets made and who pays the price for it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.